Lebman15 at Lebman15. I was thinking about why boxing draws in more fans than the UFC other than the historic conflicts it had, and I think it comes down to two things. Number one, it has always been advertised to the max by top sports channels like ESPN. Number two, boxing isn't divided and exclusive to certain promotions, so the general public know the sport as boxing and not UFC, for example. This also makes the fighters less compensated. But I feel without the UFC ruling over MMA, big fights will rarely happen. There will be a lot of padded records. What are your thoughts on the subject? Do you think UFC will one day have the same amount of viewers as boxing, considering ESPN will cover them? And will fighters finally get paid what they deserve? Thanks for your podcast. It deserves to be on the ESPN show. That would be something, huh? Boxing has a long history, and if you watch Teddy Atlas's podcast on JRE, he explains a lot of that, to be honest. He explained that back in the day, back in like the 50s, like the 40s and 50s when Joe Louis was boxing, and even a little bit after that, like the 70s and 80s when it was a golden age of boxing, boxing was the biggest sport in the world, or at least the biggest sport in the United States. And it was covered everywhere. It was on the radios everywhere. Even if you didn't have the pay-per-view, even if you didn't buy the fights, even if you didn't go to the fights, whatever it is, it was always on the radio at least, and people were listening to it no matter where they were. In their car, outside, they would play on the big speakers back in the day, and it drew in a lot of fans because of that. And of course, it did have some historic moments. Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, Muhammad Ali, some of his fights after the whole thing with the draft, and people became even bigger fans. MMA is still very young, so if we're looking at it, MMA is only, 25 years old? Boxing is over a century old. So it had over a century of promotion, a century of a path getting built on by the previous generation for the next generation to carry on forward. And it even goes for the fans, not just the boxers, even the fans. MMA doesn't really have that yet. It has it a little bit, but not much. And if you look at it today, a lot of boxing, of why it's so big, look at all the biggest stars. Canelo and Anthony Joshua are the biggest stars today. Why are they such big stars? It's a national thing, right? Canelo draws in all the Mexicans. Doesn't matter where they are. If they're Mexican, they're watching Canelo. Same thing with the British, same thing with the English that watch Anthony Joshua. They all watch their fights. Nobody else really that happens for. Triple G by himself is not a big draw. Vasyl Lomachenko is not a big draw. If you compare Triple G and Lomachenko to MMA, they are not big draws. Even in MMA, they're just normal draws. Canelo and Joshua are a little bit different. Now you look at Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather, a whole different thing. He was undefeated. He knew how to promote himself. Nobody really promoted Mayweather. He promoted himself. He talked about he was the best ever. He was very controversial at first, which carried on. He knew how to play a character, right? Very brash and outspoken at first. And then as he started fighting the younger guys, he changed his character to like this older teacher figure to these boxers. Like, yes, he's this young guy, but I'm going to sun him in there. And he was very respectful about it. He always gave the younger guys he fought more exposure. He kept saying that this guy's going to be the future of the sport. So he knew how to play characters. He knew how to change the narrative. He knew how to create the narrative for himself. And the fact that he was undefeated was kind of the backbone to all that. So everybody thought what he's saying has to be true. And a lot of people didn't like him because of how brash he was in the first place. So people wanted to see him lose. But when he changed his character, he got a lot of fans on his side. So Mayweather's a little different of a case. It's almost a little bit like Conor McGregor, how he was able to create his own thing, his own character. And yes, the UFC promoted him like crazy, and that's a big part of it. But even now, Conor kind of creates the narrative for himself. But yes, boxing is more advertised than MMA because they have a bigger platform. ESPN, all the biggest guys talk about it. Not just on ESPN, because ESPN does cover the UFC, but look at guys like Stephen A. Smith and Max Kellerman, and back in the day, Skip Bayless, and even guys before that, a long time ago. They always talked about boxing. They always talk about boxing. They talk about Mayweather. They talk about Pacquiao. They talk about Triple G. They talk about Canelo. They talk about Anthony Joshua. Who do they talk about in UFC? Just one guy, pretty much. Conor. They don't talk about anyone else. So they're not covering it as much, right? And even when they talk about Conor, it's like they have no idea what they're talking about. They're making the most generic, basic statements, basic views on the sport. And it's not interesting. And there's a real problem there. In boxing, they know a lot more. They understand boxing a lot more because of the history it has behind it. Guys like Kellerman and Stephen A. Smith were watching it back in the 80s and the 90s. UFC it really started in 1993, but the Zuffa banners started in 2001. So it's a very, very new sport. We need other mainstream what do you call these guys? Sports journalists or sports analysts or whatever they are. We need newer guys who are more up to date with the current times, at least when it comes to MMA. These guys that are on ESPN, they're on SportsCenter, they're on all the casual mainstream broadcasts, none of them understand MMA. And that's a problem. We need someone that understands it who can speak on that level. I'm so glad Ariel Helwani's on ESPN now, because at least he has somewhat of a voice, but I wish they gave him more coverage, a lot more screen time, you know what I'm saying? Because he understands the sport better than most do on that level, on the mainstream level. And when you actually look at it, guys like Triple G, guys like Vasyl Lomachenko, are they that much bigger draws than Tyron Woodley, than Stipe Miocic, than Max Holloway? They're not really. They're almost the same. When you look at their numbers, they're very, very even. Maybe Triple G's a little bit more, but it's not by much. And if the guys at ESPN and the guys on SportsCenter and guys on all these other sports media, they talked about the other champions, not Conor McGregor, not Brock Lesnar, not Ronda Rousey. They talk about guys like Whitaker, Tyron Woodley, Max Holloway, TJ Dillashaw. I actually think they would have more potential to get bigger than guys like Triple G, Vasyl Lomachenko, just for them talking about them, because you don't even see them talk about these guys. And that's a shame. And it's kind of impressive, to be honest, when you look at Whitaker's numbers, you look at Tyron Woodley's numbers, which are like 250,000 and up. It's kind of impressive that only the hardcore fans are able to generate that many buys and views for these guys. I would actually say the hardcore fans of MMA are a lot more dedicated to the sport than maybe even boxing fans. Boxing fans have a bigger audience overall when you consider casual fans, but the hardcore fans, I think, are a lot more dedicated to watch the sport. And if you can get just some of the casual fans, it'd be enough. So it's not only that ESPN doesn't really talk about it as much, it's that they can't really talk about it that much because they don't know about it that much. What are they going to say about Whitaker? Like, honestly, what would they talk about? He's an Australian fighter who, he has good hands, man. He has good hands. He knows how to use his feet to set up his hands. Like, what else would they be saying? They'll be saying the most generic stuff. Just how the other day when Shannon Sharp and Skip Bayless, they were talking about Khabib. They absolutely had no idea. They don't know how to put it into words how Khabib even fights. And we're talking about a guy who's very one-dimensional compared to guys like Max Holloway. So what would they be saying about Max Holloway? And that's a problem. So hopefully we can get some other personalities. Hopefully we can get Ariel Helwani on a bigger platform, or Brett Okamoto. We need somebody, even someone from the hardcore space that knows what they're talking about. We need somebody who can really put into words to the casual fans to bring them in. And there is nobody right now. Maybe Helwani can be that guy. I don't know. It's a shame. John Jones, the big reason why he is such a big star is because back in the day when he was a champion for a very long time, right? He was a champion where the Fertitta brothers were in charge and they knew how to promote. They promoted everybody. And when they promoted John Jones, he has the look. He was pretty much undefeated. He destroyed everybody. He was the youngest UFC champion of all time. He beat the legends, and him beating the legends who had that star quality, and almost all of them at the time, everybody catered to Jones because he beat all of them. He didn't just beat one of them. He beat all of them. So he looked like the Mayweather of the UFC in terms of who is going to beat this guy. You know, then we saw the Gustafsson fight, which nobody really thought was going to be close, and it turned out to be one of the closest fights. And when you go through adversity like that, people really pay attention, and then they started watching him a lot more, and then his rivalries with Daniel Cormier, which became his biggest fights. But it all stemmed from the promotion in the first place, and how they matched him up in the first place. He had one of the hardest, but yet one of the most rewarding roads to becoming a star, right? All those legends, but if you beat all those legends, you're going to be a star. That's how they set him up. So it's not even just ESPN and them, it's also the promotions themselves. Like, how are they promoting? Back in the day, everybody got promoted. Today, UFC 229 of all cards doesn't get promoted. Like, I don't know what's going on. And in terms of will fighters ever get paid what they deserve? Probably not, because in my eyes, fighters should be getting paid more than any other athlete on the planet. They go through a lot more. It's a harder sport. It's more demanding. It takes a lot out of you, right? I hope they do. I hope I'm wrong on that. Like, you look at basketball players, you look at football players, American football players, baseball players. You have, multiple athletes getting paid multi-million dollars, right? How many fighters make that much? 1, 2, 3 in MMA? And even that's not enough. Conor McGregor making $30 million, I still don't think it's enough. Jones, I think he was making, $7 million when he fought? That's not nearly enough. Especially for him, I think Jones should be making a lot. Even relative to those stars like LeBron James and all those guys. And dude, it's one of the saddest parts of all that. These athletes, they depend on viewership. They depend on their value as a star to get paid more, right? So if you're a bigger star, if you have more viewership, you get paid more. Pretty much. Or at least you can negotiate it in your contract and it'll be a lot more logical to happen. But how is that going to happen when the mainstream media doesn't cover you? That's kind of messed up. So these guys, these fighters can't get paid like these basketball players. Basketball's been around for a very long time. Like I said, they have this huge coverage throughout the decades and it just carries on, right? The generations keep going and the players, the fans, and the media, they grow up with it. So they all understand it. And basketball's not a hard sport to understand. So them being on the mainstream news for all this time, the players are naturally going to get paid more because of that. While nobody in the mainstream really talks about MMA.